Hello everybody, and welcome to the third video in the series on propensity score methods. In this video, we will look at other estimators which use the propensity score and a number of topics that are important when you want to actually apply propensity score methods in whichever project you're looking at. Again, this video, as the rest, is mostly self-contained. But to put my points into context, it will definitely be useful if you watch the other videos in the series. I've created a playlist for this, so check it out. I will begin with the alternative estimators. We will also briefly speak about some of the additional issues of the double robust estimator that are introduced in the previous video. And afterwards, we will go into some guidance for application. Again, if you're interested in more theoretical detail, check out the other videos in the series so you can see why these estimators should work in practice. You should be aware that all the methods that we talk about today rest at their core on the selection on observables assumption. This assumption states that selection into treatment is independent of a person's potential outcomes as long as we control for a number of covariates, xi. This allows us to solve the fundamental problem of causal inference, as we discussed in more detail in the first video of the series. That means that if selection takes place based on unobserved characteristics, almost surely the methods we speak about here will fail. For example, imagine that more ambitious people are more likely to go to college and have higher earnings regardless of whether they went to college. But if we cannot measure how ambitious people are, we still won't be able to estimate the causal effect of college on earnings, because the selection on observables assumption does not hold. That means that propensity score methods require almost the same assumptions as if you used regression adjustment. They can work better in certain circumstances. You can combine them with regression adjustment, but they're definitely very close substitutes to be used in similar situations. Furthermore, the basis of all the methods we talk about today is the propensity score theorem that I discuss in the second video of this series. To summarize, it turns out that instead of controlling for the covariates xi directly, you can also remove the selection bias by controlling for the propensity score, which is the probability of treatment conditional on covariates xi. Right, let's go to the first big piece of meat that we have for this video, which are the different methods. I won't go into very detailed explanations of why these methods work, but at their core is quite intuitive because they are all different ways to hold the propensity score constant, but in different ways. Now, the simplest way that you have probably encountered is that through a regression. That means you run a simple regression on treatment and the propensity score. The propensity score controls for the selection bias so that you can estimate the treatment effect as coefficient on the treatment variable. In practice, you can control for the propensity score non-parametrically, i.e. without imposing that the effect of the propensity score is linear as you would in a linear OLS regression. However, a linear regression nevertheless works pretty well usually. After all, you've probably heard of OLS regression as the best linear approximation if the actual conditional expectation function is nonlinear. Now, the second method is inverse probability weighting. We spoke about that in the first video of the series. There's a slightly different way you can obtain a similar estimator in practice using the regression command of your favorite software. For this, you need to first create the inverse weights here. To the treated population, you assign these weights. To the non-treated population, you assign these weights. You can then regress the outcome on the treatment variable using these weights. The reason for this is that in OLS, regression for a binary variable is just the difference in means. Now, if you assign weights, this becomes the weighted difference. And here we just assign the inverse probability weights as weights. So this is essentially a kind of shortcut if you don't want to program the whole formula. Another very common method, or actually set of methods, rely on matching. In matching, you look for similarly looking individuals, where one of them is in the treatment and the other is in the control group. You then compare the outcomes of the treated person and the person in the control group. Since they look similar, you hold the covariates fixed. In some way, this is essentially the most direct way of saying that people who look similar in the data also have similar potential outcomes. You can use the realized outcome of the non-treated person, and you can see this potential outcome because it's realized, as the counterfactual for what would have happened to the treated person if they hadn't been treated. And from this you can actually construct an individual causal effect. Now, one problem is, if you have a lot of dimensions, matching often becomes very tricky, because there is, simply speaking, a lot that can be different between people. For example, if you only measured gender and age, and you believe that these are the only critical dimensions, which might be the case maybe in medicine, then in a medium-sized sample, it is pretty easy to find suitable matches. But if you also measure and believe them to be relevant, the geographic region, the IQ, the type of industry, then it becomes much harder to find a good match. Previously, you had to find another middle-aged female. Now you have to find one that is also from California, also has an IQ of around 110, and is also trained as a lawyer. That's obviously much more demanding. And here, the propensity score comes in. Instead of matching on all the covariates you have, which can be a lot, you can just match based on the propensity score. All that matters is that the people you match have similar probabilities of treatment. That's what the propensity score theorem tells us. That's nice for two reasons, actually. Firstly, even if you have lots of variables, it's still pretty easy to match people. Secondly, if you do covariate matching, you might have included variables that barely matter. For example, maybe the region of birth does not matter at all for whether you have a college degree, but it will receive the same weight as degree and IQ. Now, if you use propensity score matching instead, variables that do not determine selection, for example the region of birth, will be almost completely excluded from the matching. So that makes it, again, easier to reduce the dimensionality and find good matches. A very similar method to matching is called substratification. You might have heard of this when you first started econometrics, because it's a very common example to introduce. Essentially, you form strata of people that are similar but not identical. For example, you compare all individuals who are between 20 and 30 years old and are female. Then, in those strata, you compare the average outcomes of the treated and control group and eventually form some sort of average of these differences. By comparing similar individuals, you hold the covariates almost fixed, which then allows you to identify the treatment effect. You can also already see how this is very similar to matching, and just as with standard matching, you can use the propensity score instead to form your stratas. That makes it easier to make your stratas tighter and base these stratas only on the characteristics that actually matter. Now, the final method is familiar to you from the previous video, the doubly robust method. For the double robust estimator, we combine inverse probability weighting and regression adjustment. The nice thing about this estimator is that it gives you a correct estimate of the average treatment effect, as long as you specify at least one of the two, the regression or the propensity score, correctly. So essentially, you get 2 shots to get the ATE. Alright, that seems great, but most of us are economists, so you're probably aware that there ain't no free lunch, or at least it's quite rare. So what are the drawbacks? Well, firstly, the estimator, the double robust estimator, usually has a slightly higher variance than the regression and the inverse probability weighting estimators. So if you know for sure that your process is correct, then you might want to go with the correct process straight away and not bother with a double robust specification. Of course, I personally cannot really imagine a situation where you know for sure that the process is correct. So this drawback is typically not very relevant. The second drawback is a little bit more severe. We said that if at least one of the 2 processes is correct, then the estimator will give you the correct average, no matter how wrong the other process is. But what happens if both the propensity score and the regression are misspecified, so neither of the 2 are correct? On this matter, the jury is still out. Obviously, it won't be consistent for the real average treatment effect anymore. Just how off it is not quite clear. Sometimes the double robust estimator performs better than either the propensity score or the regression on their own, but sometimes it also quite severely underperforms either of them, so it compounds the misspecification in both. At the moment, it mostly appears to be a matter of personal taste when you use this estimator. We've spoken a lot about the theories behind propensity score methods. So now we look at some more applied issues. In particular, we've got 3 things to look at. First, how do we actually implement the propensity score? We've come all this way, but we've never spoken about estimating the propensity score. Secondly, how do we check our assumptions? Thirdly, what are some other things we can do to improve the propensity score? Now, as a first point, how do we implement the propensity score? So, first of all, for any of the estimators we spoke about, you start with replacing the expectation and the probability with the sample equivalent. I use some estimator, P of xi, which is consistent for p hat of xi, and if there's an expectation, use a consistent estimator for the expectation. Okay, easier said than done. What estimator should we use for the propensity score? The standard approach is to use a logit model. You can also use a probit model. It doesn't matter too much. Logit models are a bit easier to compute, so they're typically used more often. What you definitely should not do is use machine learning methods like the random forests or neural networks. Those sound great in practice because they are so much more flexible than a logit model. The problem is that they are severely biased if you use them, which will make your inference impossible. There are methods to correct for that, and I plan to post a video on them at some point in the future. If you want to look it up already, the most important ones are the double debiased methods. Again, after you've gotten the propensity score, here using inverse probability weighting, you just replace everything with a sample equivalence to compute the average treatment effect. Now the question is, how do we make inference with this? The problem here is that propensity score itself is estimated, which means it is random. But that makes our standard inference invalid because we assume that the regressors are fixed. That's typically one of the main OLS assumptions, fixed regressors. There is a similar problem in two-stage least squares instrumental variables. The problem essentially is that you've got some noise in this estimate. So what can you do instead? Well, you have two options. The first, which is substantially more convenient, is to check whether your software has an inbuilt command for the propensity score method that you're using. That's very much the simplest way you can go about. Because that command then typically has the correct inference already built into it. Alternatively, for almost all the methods we spoke about, you can also use bootstrap procedures. Just make sure that you calculate the propensity score as well for each redraw in the bootstrap. Unfortunately, the bootstrap doesn't work well for estimators based on matching though, so there you need to check the software. Congratulations, you now have your propensity score. Now, there are two things you should do to check that your propensity score is alright. Firstly, you can check the common support assumption by plotting a histogram of the propensity score by treatment status. Ideally, the treated and control group have a lot of overlap, like the histogram on the right-hand side, and there is very little mass at the extremes. We have a problem if we instead have a distribution that looks like the histogram on the right side for two reasons. Firstly, as we said before, we try to construct the missing potential outcomes by comparing people with similar propensity score but different treatment status. But at these corners, there is nobody with a similar propensity score and different treatment status. We might still try to infer the missing potential outcome, but this would be purely based on extrapolation. For example, linear regression would make a linear extrapolation. The second problem is that people at these extremes get an extremely high weight if we use the propensity score as weight. You should check that you don't have too many observations at the corners. The second assumption that you can test is the probability of balance. In the last video on the propensity score theorem, we saw that all information on treatment status is contained in the propensity score, and there is no additional information in the covariates xi over and above the propensity score. That means that if you have correctly specified the propensity score, your covariates and your treatment status should be independent. You can actually test that. For example, you can regress treatment on the propensity score and the covariates. Finally, how can we improve the propensity score? Well, if you use the propensity score in weighting, there are two things that have proven very useful. The first one is called clipping. As we said before, the weight on observations at the tails becomes enormous. For example, if you have somebody who had a very low probability of being treated, but is actually treated, he has a ginormous weight. Now, that tends to make our estimator very unstable. So what we can do instead is clip the observations and only use those in the middle. So that's typically the observations with a propensity score between 0.1 and 0.9. The second issue is with the weights. You might have noticed that neither these weights nor these weights in any way are guaranteed to sum up to 1, as we would hope for in a weighted average. That doesn't matter for consistency. We've shown this in the first video, but we can improve upon the original estimator just by standardizing our weights. The estimator then looks like this. As you can see, we simply sum up all the weights and divide our original weights with the sum to get our new weights. That process is called normalization or stabilization, depending on what you read. It was introduced by Hajek in 1971. There is also something that you definitely should not do when estimating the propensity score. As we saw, it's not great to have two distributions with very little overlap in between. That means that our goal here is not estimating the probability of treatment as well as we can, but only including all interfering covariates. Now, if you have a variable that is not creating a selection problem, then you should not include it in calculating the propensity score. It does not help you solve the selection problem, but it does make your inference harder. This issue is very similar to regression adjustment as well. There too, if you include a variable that is correlated with the treatment, but not the error term, all you do is blow up the standard errors of your treatment estimate. If you come from a data science or a statistics background, this might seem a bit strange, but bear in mind that here our goal is, again, not to estimate the probability of treatment as well as we can, but to estimate the effect of treatment. Alright, we've come a long way today. What are the key takeaways? Firstly, there are lots of different methods you can use with the propensity score. One very interesting method is the double robust method that combines propensity score and regression adjustment. All the methods have advantages and disadvantages compared to other methods, but they all rely on the selection on observables assumption. Secondly, you typically estimate the propensity score using a logit model. For methods based on inverse probability weighting, you best use the bootstrap to get standard errors, or just use an inbuilt command for the method that you apply. Thirdly, to improve the propensity score, you should clip your data and normalize the weights. I realized that this video was very theoretical, so I'm preparing a final video for this series that actually shows all the theory that we discussed but applied with data. That means you can see how different propensity score estimators perform, how the tests could look like, and how the property of balance works. Also, how normalization and clipping improve the normal estimators. That video will come out in approximately 2 weeks, so make sure to subscribe so you get a notification. It would also be great if you could give this video a like. Thank you.